Mach 3, give me crew show on 2, 3, and 4.
Line 1, exit 1.
6, 3. Mach 3, give me start line 2.
5 electric. Mach 3. Line 2, Mach 9.
Mach 3, give me start line 1 and crew show on 7 and 9.
Line 1, crew show 79, Mach 9.
Yeah, do something. I hate weapons.
Super Ops, line 3, red ball, avionics.
Super Ops. Line 7 is code 3 for Flickas.
Fuck. Hey, so I started a Patreon because frankly, this stuff's getting expensive. Nothing will change the podcast or the blog if you don't subscribe, but if you want early access to episodes, monthly AMAs, episode shoutouts, voting on podcast topics, and all kinds of 20 Years Done gear, head over to patreon.com/20yearsdone. This month's top tier Patreon shoutout goes to Robbie Walker, Travis Barnes, Kevin Traw, and JT Owens. Thanks for the support. Okay, so today we're joined by a guest that's been on, 3 times now, Kevin?
This will be the fourth.
This is the fourth time, okay.
But who's counting?
Right. So Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Traw, our Lieutenant Colonel retired Kevin Traw, who was my squadron commander in 2005 to 2007-ish. And then we maintained contact kind of sporadically through the rest of my career, just like an email every 4 or 5 years, depending on how much trouble I was causing, right? And then when I fired up the 20 Years Done sort of project after retirement, that's when we started kind of corresponding more. And now he's the top fan of the podcast, right? Which actually brings me, so first of all, thank you. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for spending time. And obviously, thank you for supporting financially through Patreon, which kind of brings me to something I want to bring up. So first of all, it's kind of hard creating a Patreon and asking people to spend money on you, right? Like I'm certainly not doing this for money, obviously. But, part of that is just helping me pay for the process, paying for the license for the intro music. Like I didn't make that, I had to buy that. The hosting the podcast, is hundreds of dollars a year. A Zoom subscription in order to communicate is also, I pay for that. But then also it's the time it takes to record. Most podcasts are an hour to hour and a half, typically in length, that I kind of trim down all the ums and uhs. Like we don't actually sound this smart in real time.
Well, I appreciate that. I may pay extra for that service.
I was actually thinking about that the other day. I was like, I wonder if other podcasts, they only make the host sound, they only audio engineer the host and they leave the guest to just flounder with the stuttering and the lost words. I don't know if I'm unique, but I always try to trim it down and make people sound better and more put together. And then typically for me, like the audio engineering, that's typically 2 hours per hour of audio. So I'm looking at 2 to 3 hours per week. And then now I'm trying to do those promo videos. So I had to teach myself that. All the while I'm kind of juggling the law school thing, which, as you know, Kevin, that's pretty intensive. But the reality is I kind of did the math. I think I'm paying myself from this podcast about $2 an hour is what I'm kind of making. And then also, Kevin, you and I correspond a lot outside the podcast.
Correct.
A lot of the time I spend is on calling AFPC, calling the Pentagon, speaking to people there, and filing FOIA requests, filing appeals, researching the appeals, fighting things. It takes the reality is it just takes a lot of time. And a lot of that stuff is in the back end, and it's what gives me information for some of the podcasts, and it's part of this journey and this advocacy I'm doing. So here's what I would ask: if it's important, if you enjoy the podcast, if this is something that matters to you, if you think that the Air Force is hiding suicide data in order to protect their image, if you think that you are under-resourced as a maintainer or under-resourced as any other career field, and I kind of amplify that message to make it better. I'm not even asking for your money. What I would ask is share this podcast either by mouth, or I'm now posting promos typically where I have the best soundbite that I think from the episode that's most likely to grab people. I'm doing the promo videos. I'm doing a link to the episode. I'm sharing those. Like the way this works, the way we get change for this is to amplify the message if you agree with my message. So I would ask if you're comfortable, any of the listeners, if you're comfortable, when you see that post on Facebook, share it. Get it out there. The more people that can see it, the more people that can listen to a 30-second little blurb, that's the greater chance that I'm going to reach more people and, then I might get more Patreon subscribers, and maybe I'll be paying myself $3.50, $4 an hour or something like that. So that's my ask. You don't have to pay. I don't expect you to pay, but what I expect you, if this matters to you, to share it and help us grow. So that's a quick soapbox. Kevin, you have something to say on that?
Yeah, I do. So, I'll speak for the reason I like to support it, because, I'm very proud as you are of your time in the service, and very proud of being aircraft maintenance. And I view this as a way to not only help the service get better, but help other aircraft maintainers maybe make different decisions as they're going throughout their career to eliminate that toxic leadership, or think about an issue like the beards a few episodes ago a little bit smarter, right? And I certainly think that what I learned in the Air Force put me in a position to support this, and I think it's a way of giving back, especially you as a fellow veteran. Veterans need to help each other out. And I view that as something that if you're in the position to help other veterans, and eventually you and I will talk, and I'm sure an episode about, veterans hiring.
Right.
I do view there's no obligation, kind of like you said on the money, there's no obligation, but for those of us that can, I view it as we should, which is, I think, the exact philosophy you use. We're trying to get to the suicides, because you're in a position that you do. So I'd say if for those out there listening, if you're in a position to share, if that's what you can do it. If you're in a position to help financially, do it if you can, right? Because those little things help us all out and make the service better.
And I would also say, I spend a lot of money on the podcast. I try to promote the episodes. I promoted the beard episode on Facebook. I spent money on that. And you'll notice that Kevin sounds remarkably good today on the audio. It's because I sent him a microphone. He's been on enough times, much like I did Ashley. I got him a setup so that way no one's afflicted by his less than stellar audio from the previous episodes. So, the money is kind of just being recycled into the project anyway. So I think it's all beneficial, I'll say.
And I love listening to it. Every Friday, if it comes out Monday later, I'll listen on the way home from work. If it comes out Monday morning or Tuesday morning, I'm listening while I'm running. And I love the intro, right? I mean, I'll tell you, the intro, it's funny, it's serious. It reminds me of working online. I do like that. As funny as this sounds, I really love that intro. And it really does make me appreciate the time I had, especially in flight line maintenance, where I spend most of my time. I mean, as we know, as we age, remember most of the good things, not as much as the bad. And even the underlying stuff, and the ops person speaking about the code 3. I mean, when I hear code 3 flick, I don't know how many times I heard that. Right. I mean, of course, that was never good when you heard that. Right. But so now it's, maybe you laugh because well, I don't have to go through that, but it mostly brings back the good memories. Cause 2:00 in the morning, 5,000 miles away from the US, you just have each other. And, it's an intangible, but it brings back really good memories for me. So I think that I really do appreciate and look forward to it every week.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about PT in the Air Force, physical training, right?
Absolutely. I should have got my old PT uniform on. I still have it in my, that would have been funny if thrown that on.
I'm wearing an old ABU tan shirt because apparently that shit doesn't wear off, and they're fucking comfortable. I can't help it. So, and interestingly enough, I feel like me, Ashley, and Stromsky, I think in the careerism episode, I think we touched on PT briefly. And actually, Travis Barnes, one of the, as I'm sure people have heard in the intro, one of the top tier Patreon supporters, he had asked for PT right around when that episode was recorded, and I kind of felt like we had met that request. But especially after recent conversations on the Facebook page, and I think during some podcasts, it's like I think we really need to peel apart PT, and does it work, and what is the intention, and what can be done about it to make it better. So I guess we should frame, because when you initially reached out to me, or I think I reached out to you, I can't remember. I think there was an understanding that we didn't know where each other stood on the topic.
Correct.
And we suspected that there was going to be some disagreement.
That is exactly what we thought.
I want you to go ahead and tell me what you think of physical training in the Air Force, and why it matters or why it doesn't matter.
So I think for myself, and I'll say probably what I think the Air Force season is probably a few factors. One, I do believe it's drive down costs. Now, 22 and 23-year-olds don't get sick very much. So I do believe part of it is if you have a healthy force and physical fitness is part of that, it will at some level reduce your current healthcare costs. Many people get out, never have healthcare issues, but those that stay in, right, which is going to be 20, 30, 40% of your people who will go into their 30s and 40s when healthcare starts to become an issue. If they're otherwise healthy and being in shape is part of that, I think it'll keep costs down. The other reason I do think is a bit of the appearance issue, looking at someone who's really heavy in their ABUs, DCUs, BDUs, whatever version we're on today. OCPs, thank you. So we didn't have those when I was in. So I think that's part of it also. Certainly certain career fields, I think you covered that in that episode, require it. I think that for aircraft maintenance, certainly like the cardio, I'm not going to disagree. That's not as valuable. I do think that some of the strength training, maybe you argue that you have physical fitness is tailored towards the career field. And I think that some of that, maybe that would be an area that probably could warrant some specific looking at. But I think that that's the two reasons. I think that to drive down cost, and they don't want people to look bad. I don't really think in most career fields in the Air Force, it's because they think they're going to be in a situation that you're going to actually need that at that moment, because most of those physical situations are going to be a very short span of any activity going on.
Okay. That's a good synopsis of your position. My position is I'm a big proponent of physical fitness now. I didn't used to be, but it also might have been because I had a metabolism that was going 1 billion miles an hour. So it was like, this shit doesn't apply to me. Right. I'm skinny all the time. It's fine. Certainly not the case at 42 going on 43. I was telling Kevin, I built a home gym. And so I've been lucky enough. And now when I go to the gym, it takes, 30 seconds to get there. But when I joined the Air Force, the PT wasn't bad in basic training. I mean, I was a skinny kid. I was like 6 foot, 144 pounds when I entered basic training. When I left basic training, I was 6 foot, 166 pounds. So I put on 22 pounds in basic training. Much of it I attribute to 3 square meals a day, which I didn't necessarily have when I was growing up, right? But also the PT, which I think was 6 days a week, I think it was. I think Saturday we used to do a run, like a road run. But I think the rest of the week it was alternating strength training versus cardio. And on Sunday, I think was the day basically where it was like a free day. And then I'm the type of person where I hate running. There's never a time. I mean, I used to go and run because I still want to run. I still want to be good at running. It bothers me I'm not good at running. When it comes down to it, I think working out is really important because I'm also viewing it through you're only in the service for a certain amount of time, and then this is the only body you have for the rest of your life. And the more you can do on the front end sets you up with behaviors and patterns that'll keep a healthy lifestyle throughout your life, and the better off you're going to be at 60, 70, and 80 and stuff like that. And certainly that's going to play into costs, right? I imagine that cost was certainly a factor, and very obviously image was a factor, because I'm sure you remember in what was it, like 2009 to 2012 or 13, there was a blurb in the Air Force fitness program regulation that said, even if you pass every single category, even if you get 100 on the whole test, if you look bad in your uniform, you can go on commander's PT. Now, that's not a likely scenario to happen, that if you're getting 100, right?
It's unlikely, but there could be some circumstances, but I agree, it would probably be unlikely.
But you could very, very well get high 80s to 90s.
Agree with that, for sure.
And be on commander's PT, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I was a little bit before that era as a commander, but if they met the standard, they were good. If they missed the standard by 0.1, they weren't, right? So while I may have been firm, I tried not to be arbitrary. I'm sure there's some listeners may disagree with that, right? But that was my goal, right? You're either in the program or out. So I don't believe I ever had someone participate in PT because I thought they didn't present the right image. So I'm basically, if you pass, you're good.
I had in 2012 or 13, I had an airman who was heavier set. I think he was scoring in the high 80s. And my AMU chief at the time, who I adored, pulled me aside and said, you need to go have a talk with so-and-so. He needs to lose some weight soon, or he's going to go on commander's PT for military image. And it really fucking bothered me. I mean, I went in and talked to him, and I did my duty as an NCO, senior NCO, and I talked to him. And then afterwards, this was before I was like lifting weights and working out. This was where I was just the same amount of muscle, and then everything was getting lower on my body, if that makes sense.
We all age, and it's going to get worse, Chris. Let me tell you, when you start reaching the closing the 50s, it's going to get worse.
It felt like I was slowly fucking melting is what it looked like, right? And after I talked to the guy, I went back to the chief. I said, hey, I want you to evaluate me for military image then. There's no way that I can levy this standard on this guy without you without making sure you're applying the same standard to me. And he said, Chris, you look fine. And it also very well could be that I was a master and I had enough money where I could buy bigger and bigger uniforms, because a lot of that military image is just, I mean, how many times did you as a commander, when a guy comes in for a fucking PT fail as a senior airman or whatever he was, and he's wearing his fucking uniform from basic and his buttons are screaming, it's like, dude, what the fuck are you doing here? Like, go get a new uniform. I don't care what you got to do, but don't show up to the commander's office for a PT fail with buttons screaming. You may not even be that overweight, but you're certain, like, dude, I am not 144 or 166 fucking pounds anymore.
Right.
If I tried, my kids might be able to wear my basic training stuff, but if I tried to get into it, it would be a Chris Farley scene for fucking sure.
If you're there for PT,
yes,
your uniform should be fine no matter where you're there, because if you're in the commander's office. But for that specifically, where it's somewhat of a judgment call, depending on, like, especially military image, you want to present the right image for sure. And that's, because if you failed your test or you're on the edge and everything's really tight and ill-fitting, then you're not helping yourself in that military image piece.
I want to touch on the military image now, just because I think we're already there and it's convenient. Maybe it's just me, but I don't give a fuck about military image. I care, are they competent? Are they good? And then we're talking about going to Circle K or whatever, and they're overflowing whatever it was. I mean, you'll see it every once in a while. Like, there's that one in the Marine, and there's like the National Guard guy from New Jersey, whatever it was. Like,
right.
Anybody listening who's been in the military knows exactly what the fuck I'm talking about. Where you're like, I don't understand how the fuck this happened. Like, how is that guy there? But those are like the very, very, very rare cases. And you might see some people that are heavy set, overweight, I'm not even doing BMI, but just bigger.
Right.
But also, like, when I was in the military, like, I didn't necessarily struggle with my weight, but I definitely was a little bit self-conscious about it. Right. And when I moved into the civilian, when I retired, I am probably below the civilian national average for
sure.
You know what I mean?
For sure you are. Yeah, absolutely.
So at that point, does the military need to, if we're strictly talking military image, I'm not talking health, I'm not talking anything else. If one of the justifications for the PT program is for military image, does the military have to match the Hollywood image of the military, or does the military just have a better physical image than the run-of-the-mill American around there walking around?
So I don't think it has to match the Hollywood image. I actually think it just needs to be better than the run-of-the-mill. And really, I think it comes down to is you have to use a standard. I think using the PT test is the best example, right? If they can pass the PT, which has strength and cardio in there, so it's got the various components. And if their uniform's wrong size, then have a conversation about that, right? I mean, if someone's 6'3" and bulky, but they're otherwise in shape, just say, get the right uniform size. I think that for a lot of people wearing the right uniform, I was, I can't say I remember distinctly someone coming in, but I think I remember having conversations about, like, if they pass the test and they're wearing the right size uniform, I am good with that.
That feels fair.
I think that's how I kind of view it.
Okay. So I agree. So we haven't disagreed yet, right?
We'll have to find something.
We will. Okay. So I kind of agree with the push-ups and the sit-ups. Me as a tall guy with some fucking arms that are like, I have a wingspan of like a California condor or something. But, so the push-ups, they're a pain in the ass. It's a lot of travel. It sucks. But I'll tell you what, those sit-ups, man, with those long arms, it's easy. So it feels like that equalizes a little bit, right? But the waist, I feel like the waist measurement, especially I remember there was a shirt in the 756. It was after you left, I think. And he was like 6'4", 6'5", played a lot of softball, and he was just built.
Right.
And every single time he would have to do the shrink wrap, do the wrap around the waist, because he literally had a core that was like a tree trunk. And it was not, I mean, yeah, he had body fat because, you know, you need body fat in order to live, right? But he was probably, if I had to guess, now that I understand basically what most body fat looks like, I would say he was probably 10 to 11%, which is a really good.
Very good, yes.
Right? And he would still get 39 and a half or whatever it was between the threshold of passing and failing. Like, it feels like the waist measurement, and never mind the fact that, like, no shit, when in 2010, I got notified, I was working mid shift, and I got notified at 1 a.m. that I was going to have a PT test that morning, but I was waist only because of the back issues I had. And I was literally in the middle of eating a fucking donut when I got the email. And I was like, oh, fuck. And I was like, I'm waist only. And, you know, when you're a single category, it's now weighted tremendously, right?
Those were waist only, which was not an uncommon one, was tough, right? And
Right.
So, and we had one of the chiefs in our squadron when I was there who had fairly serious medical conditions, who I go back to my time in Korea, I'd known him forever, who was waist only. And it did not seem right that he was waist only, because he was in fairly good shape and his medical conditions were fairly severe, and it put a lot of strain for the waist only. I don't have a problem, you know, like I was really good at the push-ups and fine on the run and the waist, but the sit-ups killed me. I only maxed them one time, right? Considering most times I maxed everything out. Only one time in the Pentagon, because, you know, the Pentagon, a lieutenant colonel is like a senior airman up there.
Correct.
They give you a 3-day pass if you get 100. So
can you take those though? Does the Pentagon let you take fucking passes? You're going to alienate this whole fucking audience if you say yes.
Yes. A lieutenant colonel in the Pentagon is like a senior airman in the field. No kidding. You know, without going to that, I mean, literally, I remember I was pushing my CVS cart and there was an Army sergeant there. He goes, I've never seen a lieutenant colonel pushing. I said, I'm the snacko. Like, I said, before this, I was a squadron commander, which is equivalent to battalion commander. He's like, I said, yeah. And last week I was on urinalysis, right? And I literally remember my second day in the Pentagon, I'm on an escalator and there's a Marine 3-star. And he like looks at Lieutenant Colonel and says, I'm just going to talk him up like you would an airman at the base. I'm like, you want to be ignored. Like, I don't want to talk to the 3-star Marine general.
How was your in processing? Is your dorm room nice?
Yeah, he goes, so where do you work? I go, I work here. And he goes, well, say hello to, you know, Chuck, who was like our 3-star. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to go say hello. Like, but I get he was trying to be friendly, right? So anyway, so yeah, in the Pentagon, and I took my 3-day pass. I didn't get to take it all 3 days in a row, but they were like, yeah, you earned your 3-day pass. So anyway, that was the only time I ever maxed my crunches. But so yeah, I think that the waist seemed, as a commander, the least fair, and waist only, I don't think that was right. Because that's just of the hardest, and I think the least good measure of physical fitness was that, and for waist only. So yeah, I think that was not a good one at all.
And so going back to when I was waist only, I went in and I was fucking nervous. I knew, because I think waist only, it was like a 37 and a half. Anything bigger than 37 and a half was failing because of the way it was weighted, because there's no other categories. Yep. And that donut was not doing me fucking favors at all. Like, the yeast was expanding for sure. And I went in and the dude, I lifted up and I sucked in. I did all the things they say not to do, but everybody fucking does it, right?
They pull the tape really tight when they're not supposed to.
I'm telling you, first thing he said was 35. And I fucking opened, because my eyes were closed, so I was sucking so hard. And I opened my eyes and I looked in the mirror, and it looked like a baker cutting dough with string where you couldn't even fucking see. I couldn't see the tape. He had buried it in my waist. And I was like, fucking 30. He went 35, 35, 35. I'm like, fuck, thank God. I think that just goes to show that, like, when you're waist only, let's just use waist only as a microcosm of what the waist measurement is. Usually you're waist only because you have a pretty not necessarily serious, but you have a physical condition that restricts.
I'm going to say serious.
Yeah.
The ones I saw were serious.
I had spinal problems, right? So I was like out for nearly everything. And it's really hard to like maintain your weight when you are kind of stuck in that level of inactivity, because everything you do hurts. Like you have to sit down, even sitting down hurts. So it's laying down and you can't walk and you have, pain all the time. And I'm not trying to like make excuses here, but to weigh the waist so heavily, running concurrent with somebody that is on a severe sort of activity restriction, it seems almost punitive or intentionally punitive at that point. I know we can't speculate on what it was, but it just seems like it was extra dangerous. But also I want to go to talk about the subjectivity of that waist measurement. Much like in my story, I was not a fucking 35. I was not a 37 and a half. I wasn't a 40. So in my mind, I shouldn't have failed. But when that dude squeezed the tape, like I have done where I took a PT test and I had to stop and I came back the next week and my waist measurement changed by 2 fucking inches in a week. And there's zero chance my waist had a 2-inch difference. I had not done anything. I mean, I'd worked out for an extra week. But that just goes to show that the waist measurement
is by far the most subjective. And see, I think that in terms of subjectivity, I think that the run was the least subjective.
Agreed.
It was probably the least popular by people. I'm going to say I think the crunches were the next, because you had to touch your knees, right? Mm-hmm. Push-ups. I mean, I think it was pretty clear what a good push-up was and what a good push-up wasn't, but the waist was completely subjective. And like I had a 1-inch difference on my 3, on like the 1, 2, like that's not actually possible, right? To have a 1-inch measurement difference. And that one, I think, required the best trained person to do, right? I mean, the other ones were relatively, so I think that the waist one was the one that I always very much struggled with, because of if it was waist only, the subjectivity, it was not, if you think about if a good test needs to be repetitive in terms of the results.
Yes.
And that was, I think, on the waist, it failed to meet that criteria. And if I remember, that was 30%, right? It was 50, 30, 10, and 10, right? And so right. I always found, again, it may have changed now, but I always found that I thought the 30 was disproportionate. And I think that was, if you want to argue how much the Air Force care about image versus cost, I think 30% was image, because that was image. Maybe the other 70% was cost and ability to do their job, right? Maybe that was the calculation, but I really struggle with the waist.
You talk about, you should be able to repeat it in order to prove that it's not subjective. Right. I think that's why they would do that 3 measurements, but it's the same person and it's within 30, 45 seconds, which means their methodology, their biases or whatever is creeping into that process. That's not a true subjective. Yeah, you measure it 3 times, but that's just basically the person couldn't suck in.
What just proves the non-repeatability of that specific one, to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm interested, you talked about cost, like the cost of having a healthier force in like medical expenses. And really, we're probably talking about long-term chronic sort of stuff. We're talking about type 2 diabetes, heart disease, all that stuff, which means I think we won't even know if we're saving money, because what we're really looking for is on the VA side of this equation. Because you're talking about long-term health effects from a healthy lifestyle and stuff like that. I think the reality is, you're talking 30 to 40 years before the VA is going to be able to shit out the data saying, hey, a veteran heart disease is way down or whatever it is, right?
But then it'd be hard to prove, is it from the PT or is it because people eat, well, some people eat, if you want to make healthier choices, like there's leaner meat now, we know more about chicken, drinking water, things like that. So it may be very hard to kind of like correlate, let's say, the push in the Air Force, which was really kind of the early 2000s, late 90s, and then run that, out. You'd have to kind of isolate that group versus the population. And of course the military, because it's skewed to younger, and there is physical activity. That's also because, a lot of jobs in the Air Force and many of the other services are physical in nature, right? I mean, aircraft maintenance, you're moving around all day long. Maybe not in some of the jobs, but in maintenance you are. So, aircraft maintenance makes up it's not half the force, but it's plurality of the force, right? It's well over 100,000. So you have a decent amount of your force that is in a role that is active by nature.
Very much so.
I do find that if you want to take the PT part out, I think the military does put emphasis on preventive care. And there may be disagreements, but I'm in healthcare, so I have a little bit of knowledge in this area, right? Boy. I think that the health care in the military tries at its philosophical level to be preventative. And I think if you look at the PT as part of that, it makes sense. If you look at the PT as punitive, then it doesn't make sense.
Okay.
And so it varies.
So I want to talk about a little bit more about the subjectivity of the test. Like you talked about how the push-ups are the next probably to the waist, right?
Yes.
Which has a lot to do with that 90-degree.
Yes, that's exactly right.
How far apart your feet are. I agree. Like the sit-ups seem pretty cut and dry. Do your elbows touch and do your shoulder blades touch? And if you've done those two things, it's really hard to kind of fudge it. How much do you think that people not hitting 90, like, because the other services, at least the Army and I think the Marines, well, I don't know what they're doing. They're all doing all those Spartan race fucking PT tests now. I don't know what the fuck they're doing, but back, 10 years ago, they would do push-ups in 2 minutes and sit-ups in 2 minutes. And what they would really happen was they would reach like failure. Your muscles don't work anymore and you can't push yourself up and you're down and you're out and that's it. Right. And obviously it was a higher number, but in order to max out push-ups for, I think, an 18-year-old, I feel like I should have these numbers up. Once again, another failure of this podcast, have data available. But I think if I remember correctly, and comment if I'm not right, in order to max out push-ups for an 18-year-old male, I think it's like 58 push-ups in a minute.
I thought it was in the 60s, because I remember when I was taking my tests in the 30 and 40 year age group, I thought I had to get to the low 50s, but maybe, and 18 is, and now they do the 10-year span, which I have a tough time on that, right? Because I'm in pretty good shape and I think I'd have a hard time at 49. When I turn 50, I think I'd kill it. But at 49, I think I'd have a little bit of, at least somewhat of a challenge.
Yeah. Okay. So I was wrong. Looks like for an 18-year-old man, it is 67 push-ups in a minute.
So that's why I was a commander, right? Because I had that stuff on lockdown.
Yeah, that's important that you have that. What a wealth of knowledge.
That serves me well on daily, right? Wake up and like, I know how many
that's
push-ups
why you want to.
That's
why you want to do this PT podcast. You're like, I got all this worthless fucking PT knowledge. I need to fucking flex it. Okay, so you're talking about 67 in a minute. That's less than it's an up and down in less than a second.
Right.
You're not going to have fucking good form doing that.
No, and that's the problem I see with that, right? Because I think that I did feel like, and I did push-ups every night. I felt like the high number was begged cutting it because it just seemed not like able to do a proper push-up. Therefore, if people are in shape and do push-ups, can't meet it, then is the standard wrong, right? So, and I really felt it was very, like, I don't think that's realistic. I mean, and there's probably a kinesiologist out there that can tell me if I'm right or wrong, but that does not seem realistic to go up and down in a proper form in less than a second, right? I don't know that that's possible. Hence why I think that's the second most subjective, right? Is because of that issue.
No, I agree. And I'll say, like, that 67, we're averaging less than a second on an up and down. But the reality is you're going to slow. So, I think the reality is, like, if you're trying to do an up and down in a second, that's the average. But the reality is you're going to start faster in the beginning and you're going to slow down towards the end as you kind of get tired, which means you're talking about people trying to do probably a push-up up and down full travel in half a second.
I was gonna say about half second
for at least the first 20 to 30 in order to hit 67 at a minute. That's dumb. That's manifestly stupid.
Yeah, I agree. Cause I'm like, I would do, most of my career, I would do push-ups every night. I'd probably do 300 a night. And, for me is about the 30, 35 second where you hit it. Right. And I'll say maxed it fairly easily, but you hit that wall. Right. I mean, certainly there's certain people that won't, but for people that work out, they're going to hit that wall probably around 30 to 35 seconds. So yeah, maybe that's where the Air Force should look at, like more of the Army, Marines with the go to the fatigue, to make it more realistic. Because I just don't think the minute is just too rapid. Where again, if you're more paced in a push-up, you can be better, I think. But because the Air Force was 1 minute, you had to go up and down fast, where maybe that's where the 2 minute would have been a better measure of, someone's ability to do a push-up.
Who legitimately reaches muscle fatigue, muscle failure at 67 at a minute? Like, I just don't see that happening. I think most people are running out of time, or they're doing crummy push-ups. If you push it out to 2 minutes, people aren't going to make it 2 minutes.
Right.
They're going to hit that ceiling, whatever that number is, and we're going to know what their actual strength is, not how quickly they can apply their strength in this bizarre scenario.
Right. And that's where I think the Air Force could have really looked at, again, the concept of a PT program, I think, is excellent. And they, for whatever reason, once they got to that 1 minute, the run, the waist, even though it seemed like they're always studying it, they never could get away from it. Right. It just seemed like they kept going back to it. I don't know if it's because they invested so much time or they're worried about potential consequences of change, but the services change their physical fitness standards regularly. So I don't really know that. Again, I'm not an expert in that field, but it just seemed odd as someone who was in shape, and I spent time as a PTL and as a commander. It never just really lined up as completely passing the common sense way of doing things.
Yep. So there's also this, and I don't know if I ever saw it, but it always felt like there was a thread running through everything. And I'm interested what your take is as somebody that was a squadron commander, and maybe you could see things from the other side. There had been stories of like group chiefs, of command chiefs, of 06s, or I think 2 or 3 star generals or whatever, who fucking failed the PT test, and they would just lean on the test taker and get it thrown out, and they'd come back in a week and they'd get a pass, and there'd be no sort of documentation of the first test. Is that a thing?
So I was a PT on the Pentagon, you remember, because of Lieutenant Colonel.
Because you're a senior airman,
got it. Right? So, and I remember doing a reserve. I think she was reserve 2-star. She had to pass. Now, she got around the track. I mean, she was like 57, 58. So I was a little concerned, but she did it. I can't say that I ever saw or heard that. Could it have happened? Yes.
That's fair.
Should it have happened? No. I mean, I was in the Pentagon and delivering PTL. And I will say the biggest problem we had in the Pentagon is I was in my directorate. I was one of the only ones who had been a PTL previously. So what I saw was variability in the PTL's ability to administer a test was the issue versus the PTL trying to hook someone up.
Yeah.
Right.
Makes sense.
Because I think that really, because sometimes they would misunderstand the rules and things of that nature. So no, I never saw that. Could I see it happen? And again, I think that that's where, they talk about the integrity of the system. Right. And that's where really, if that person doesn't pass, they need to own that. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, I mean, if like anything else, should you really kick someone out who is, if they've risen that level and they're a good performer, they're having trouble on their PT test. But if you're going to kick out a senior airman for that, though, again, once someone got to 18 years, you weren't kicking them out for PT anyways. I mean, we had a case in the 756 when I was there where, there was someone I demoted where I just said, I'm not going to demote him again. He's going to get to his 20 and we're good. Right. I made that call. But I just really think that if that's happening, that really takes away from, the message. Right. And we've talked before. I certainly didn't agree with the, different spanks for different ranks.
Yep.
But, you can only control what's in your control. But I really do think I think maybe there's a little bit, I think that's not as pervasive as people think. Has it happened? Absolutely.
I think you're right. I think it's not pervasive, but I think each time it happens, the ripples are huge. But
it's worse. If a general does that, it's worse than if a senior airman does it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I used to say, if an officer or a senior NCO gets in trouble in the squadron, I'm going to take a harder push on it than an NCO, than an airman. Conversely, if action's not taken when someone's serious, I think it's worse.
Yeah.
Right. Because so I think that's how that, and so that's why it is. If one general or one, command chief isn't held that standard, then that is worse. It's worse than letting a senior airman slide, in my opinion.
So how much do you think that type of behavior, I mean, neither of us have seen senior leaders leaning on PTLs to throw out tests, but I think we both agree it has very likely, almost certainly happened at least once, right?
The power dynamic means it probably has had to happen, and I'll say more than once.
I agree. So how much do you think of that is because of the stigma of a PT fail for someone that is mature in their career, the shame that goes along with it, the ego, the the perceived failure, the going to commanders. Although I certainly remember there were some senior enlisted leaders and they did not go to commanders PT. They cut a deal with their boss and said, you just PT and get your shit taken care of, Chuck, or whatever, and pass your next fucking test, call it a day. Like, they didn't go to commander's PT, which I always saw commander's PT. There's a stigma associated with commander's PT as well, which I'm sure you're aware of, that it's shameful that you have to go to commander's PT. Like, your coworkers know you go, you have to leave at certain times. And then it's just, that is the shame of the failure.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a stigma with failing PT. Now, you could, I don't think it should have been viewed with shame, but it was, right? That is how it was viewed. And as you know, I did lead our PT every morning, and sometimes I lead that. So for my 2 years as a commander, I did PT every morning. On Fridays, we did it with the other AMXS at Luke. And on Friday, we had the chiefs and the officers who that was their shift would come PT to kind of set an example. That was, I think, part of my way of trying not to make it a stigma, because if I'm there, chiefs are there on that Friday. I mean, I was there every day. The chiefs were there. I felt that it would make it more about doing the physical fitness and getting you in shape as opposed to shaming you, right? And then I would show up. Our squadron PTL ran the afternoon one, and probably 2 or 3 times a month, I would go out there and PT with them, right? Because I felt, again, I should be out there with them, because I also wanted to see the effort. Because if I was going to make a decision about someone's career, and a commander has a lot of latitude, especially
and if you saw
in PT,
they were busting their ass and they were humping it out, and then they still failed, you'd be like, okay, that mattered. I'm not going to demote you because I know you've been pushing, and just keep pushing. You'll get there, buddy. Right.
That mattered. And there was one I talked to, I remember it was an airman. I said, what'd you have for dinner last night? Oh, I had 10 tacos at Taco Bell. I said, that probably is not a good idea. I said, one, it's really not healthy for anyone. I said, 2, it's a waste of money. You just go to the chow hall, right? Or dining facility. Sorry. Don't want any of the dining facility people get upset at me. And, that's not good. Like and I appreciate they told me, right? Because I thought that was important, but I said, that's not how you do it. I said, so you got to pass this PT test, and eating the 10 Taco Bells will not get you there, right? I said, once you pass the test and maintain your physical fitness, I may not think it's a good idea, but you should wait till then, right? So I do think that being there, I was able to have those conversations. So not only could I see their effort, but I could help try to influence it. And we had very few people fail a second time. I know I looked at the stats back then, but I think our second failure rate was probably less than 5%, certainly under 10, right? We had very little. I think that was part of it, is because I'd say some people were never going to get in great shape. I said, I want to get you in good enough shape. If you go to do this for the next 9 days, you will get a 75. That was my goal. I think some people that Hollywood, I wasn't trying to get into 100. It wasn't the goal. I wanted to give them to a 75. I said, really, to get to 75, you should be shooting for an 80, because that way, if you have a bad day on a push-up or a bad quarter lap, you're good. And that was it, right? Some people, I want to get 100. Like, you got a 65 last time. Yeah. I don't think you're going to get 100 this time, but you can get an 80. And so I'm really happy. I do think that trying to take a little of the stigma, but absolutely there's a stigma. There's no doubt, that even in the squadron, I try not to make it a big deal in terms of a stigma. There was, because as you've talked about, you're the tribe, you're out, you can't be doing that work. You have to go with the commander. you got to report and do all those things. And you see that, right? There is, even if it's not purposely put a stigma, there is, because you're taken out of the labor force and other people have to pick up your work.
Okay, man, I hope we don't have to do a two-part on this. I just realized there's just so much to talk about with this, but
yeah, you haven't even gotten a discipline piece.
So prior to 2006 or so, PT was part of the duty day in the reg. And it was commanders will or shall, whatever the magic must word was, give their personnel 3 days a week, 1.5 hours a day for PT as part of their duty day, right?
Right.
And I remember that. That was, we were just coming off the ergo test, because I was in Korea when we moved from ergo to push-up, sit-up, and the new stuff.
Ergo test was terrible.
Oh yeah, I loved it. There's no prep. But
and I never could pass it.
Oh yeah, because your heart's like, this is fucking Bush League. And you're
right.
Like, and then the guy sitting there drinking a Mountain Dew would be like, well, sir, I'm sorry you failed. And you're like, okay, well, this is just fucking the worst. And
right. It was that was demoralizing.
Did you try smoking? Everybody said smoking before would get your heart rate up. You should have done that.
I've never had a cigarette. I don't even know how I would light a cigarette.
I bet you do. I mean, even if you haven't, I bet you're a smart enough
I burn
dude.
my hand. If I put it underneath, I'd probably burn my hand.
All right. Well, okay. So that went away. And what we used to do was, initially we were doing, I think we were doing the PT on the back end. I was on swing shift for probably all of that time. We were doing PT on the back end. And then what was happening was pro supers would use us at 12 and be like, hey, we just worked 12s. You want us to go PT? And really the 12s back then were off the line at 12, and you're doing cams and tools and forms until 13 and a half. And they're like, all right, well, now it's a PT. It's Monday, so it's PT day. And you're like, we're at our fucking 13, 14 hour mark. We're not going to PT. And then the pro super would always be the guy. He was the only adult in the room on swing shift. Be like, okay, yeah, you guys can go home and I'll vouch for you, whatever. And then everybody caught on that you just can't do it that way. So it shifted to, okay, well, PT is at the beginning of your shift, and that begins your 12-hour day. And pro supers lost their fucking mind, because people they thought had another hour and a half in them were now pulling off the line an hour and a half before what the pro super expected, and be like, oh, damn, it's a PT day. And you'd be all mad because they lost productivity. Like, that was my experience with PT in the duty day, but we also always did it.
I mean, certainly I think that the way should handle it. If you want to make it a requirement, you should fit it during the duty day, and you should back off whatever work. Now, in some of the units, that's really easy. You just don't open the office up, right? In maintenance, I would say, you would say, hey, that hour and a half, 3 days a week is going to cost us, 10,000, 20,000 hours of flights across the years, then back it off, right? And then, of course, you can't say this with the term, because the term patterns are different for all of the other. Mm-hmm. And maybe heavies work 24/7, 365. Maybe it was a little bit easier for them, because if they had aircraft off station, or they weren't on station in a more, like a overseas base, they could kind of work around it. But in fighters, you're so tied to a specific schedule and term pattern, right? I think that they really should have, had call it a reduced first go, significantly reduced first go, and then have a normal go, or maybe, reversed attrition. There's negatives on that too, right? But, if you're normally like a 12-10, maybe it's a 4-12.
Yeah.
Right. Reverse it out, because certainly you would have the front lines for that, unless you really had a lot of trouble. So I think that would have been the way to do it. And they could have calculated it. I mean, there's people, you throw these in the calculator, they can say this is how many hours we're not going to fly. And that would have been the way to handle it, I believe. And then you could have gotten people to do it, because it seemed inherently unfair that we had to follow the same rules. That, again, and this is not to diminish other career fields. In the MPF, they would just say, closed for PT, we're not opening to 10.
Yep.
And that is not meant to be a criticism in this case. Their office hours during lunch, I'm criticizing that, but this one I'm not. But we couldn't do that, Maze, because unless you reduced the flying, that was the number one driver of our maintenance. So we had your scheduled maintenance, but scheduled maintenance you could work around, but you had your unscheduled, and of course just prepping the jets. So I think that's how the Air Force should have handled that. And that would have been inherently fairer, and it would have cut down on PT failures, no doubt, right? And I think it would have been good for camaraderie. I know that when we did the commander's PT, about every third or fourth Friday, we would do ultimate frisbee or something that was fun. And that was certainly good for morale, right? To do that. So you can do that. But again, the Air Force didn't make the decision. I'm sure they don't today for the maintenance, because that's what we're talking about, of cutting back the flying schedule, which is the only way to drive down the amount of work for the flight line.
But here's what I don't understand. We were flying more sorties when we had PT during the duty day.
Because that wasn't a part of the calculation, right?
But we were meeting the sorties. Like, we were hour and a half before work, we would be at the PT, then we'd show up at work, and then, you know, swing shift would come in a little bit early. Like, they'd lose time on the back end, the overnight recovery time for the next day. But we were still hitting all the sorties. And I think the reality is because we had more people.
Yeah,
we had more experience, right?
Chris, I was going to say there's other factors, because
sure,
also in the early 2000s, when you had, you know, the post 9/11 plus
ramp.
up, and you know the aircrafts are older now, but the aircraft were less old than they were in 2014, right? So I'm going to argue that you certainly, and you had the recession of the 2000 and the post 9/11, you had, you know, you had more people coming in and staying, right? And that was an experience issue. So I'm going to say that the PT was able to survive in that environment because you had other factors that contributed to our ability to fly more sortie. I mean, at Luke, when I was there, there's a training unit, right? Which is different, but it was much easier to make sorties there when I was at Hill Air Force Base in the early 90s, when those jets, I remember we did our first 6,000 TAC motor, right? I mean, we were still hitting first milestones. Like, I was there when we hit our first aircraft hitting 2,000 hours, because most of them were 15, 1,600. So, but yet we were lucky to do a 10 turn A. Of course, we were 18 PA versus 24. And our MC rates I was happy to be in the 70s, right? When the jets were a lot newer. Yet fast forward when I'm in block 25s and I was hitting the 80s. Well, what happened? The jets were older, but your manpower was more experienced, and you had part support. So I think that's why PT was accessible during that period you talked about, because you can meet your commitments because of other reasons.
Okay, so I'm going to unpack this here in a second. But what other off-duty activities is mandatory in the military, and if you don't do it, you're going to get kicked out? Like, if I don't go to college, I'm not going to get kicked out, right? I may not get promoted. I might higher tenure or whatever.
Okay, I was going to use education, but you're right. I mean,
you're right. I could never do anything, right?
Right. You may not get promoted. You may higher tenure, but
I'm probably going to make staff, and now staff can retire at 20 years, right? They bumped it back up. Okay. What about volunteering? Do I have to volunteer? And if I don't volunteer, will I get kicked out of the Air Force? Okay.
You will not.
So I'm trying to think, what activities does the Air Force require of me to do on my own time that if I don't do it, I will be kicked out of the Air Force?
That PT seems to be the only one.
PT does seem to be the only one.
The other ones could have a negative impact on your career, but a PT will have a for sure 100% negative impact if you fail that test.
I wouldn't argue the other two have a negative impact. They have a neutral impact and a non-positive impact.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Well, you're in law school, so you're pretty good at the wording.
Well, what I'm saying is it's like you're not going to get an LOC or LOR because you didn't volunteer.
No, absolutely, you're correct. You're
know
okay.
I mean?
You're a non-positive. Yes, from that, I guess I say if you higher tenure, you could view that as a negative. But if that's not, that's a neutral from your perspective.
But also, like if you're about to high your tenure and you're coming up that year before, you could probably do 2 volunteerisms and get 2 CLEPs in, and then you're going to get promoted to whatever that is. I think.
Correct. I mean, and same with working on your whatever degree, whether it's CCAF or you can throw PME in there, but PME falls the same as education.
I mean, of these two things, we're talking education and volunteerism. Those are off-duty activities that are, typically not on duty, although sometimes you can get them on duty too, right? How many man hours per year does it take to meet those criteria for an EPR? Because you only have 2 volunteerism bullets on the most recent EPR I've seen, and 2 self-improvement bullets, right? So you're talking volunteerism is typically 4 to 6 hours on a Saturday, twice a year, in order to get 2 volunteerism bullets. Is that
Right.
You think that's a fair?
Yeah, that's fair, right? I mean, and sometimes the volunteer activities can be during work hours. I don't know.
Right.
For me, if someone said I volunteered during the duty day or I volunteered on Saturday, I don't know that I would have said one was better than the other. I kind of viewed it as maybe the one on the Saturday was more of an interest to them. So I don't, you could absolutely do volunteering during work and not, again, I think, unless you had those people saying, well, you need to do it off duty.
Right.
Interesting enough, if you had to say to me, what do I think is more important for development of the force between physical fitness and education? And I had to pick one, I would pick education.
Yep.
Saying I could only pick one, I would say that I think what education brings the force, if only picking one, is more important. So it's kind of interesting that the one that I believe provides more value is not mandatory during work, but the one is lesser value is mandatory and more capricious if you don't do it.
Okay. So I agree that you can probably, I mean, I saw a lot of volunteerism. If you went up to your flight chief and said, hey, I want to work at PIR was like the golden goose of volunteer stuff. They would be like, hell yeah, you can take this off. And I'll probably give you a CTO next week too, because we need to feel this, right? But we'll say worst case scenario, you get no time off. You're looking at 12 hours a year in order to hit your 2 volunteerism bullets.
Right.
Is that fair? Okay.
Fair.
Okay. And school, in order to get 6 credit hours, it's, man, I feel like I should know
90
the math.
hours. I mean, you're talking 45 hours for a semester, 3 unit class. And so, yeah, so call that 90 hours for those that study, maybe a little more.
Okay. That's fair. And then
100 hours.
And then there's also the CLEP, which requires about 3 hours. And that's like a one-off and they're finite. But if we were going to do worst case scenario here, and this is for not things that will kick you out if you don't do it. These are things that just will bump you up for promotability, right? So that's 12 hours a year for volunteerism, and worst case scenario, 90 hours a year for 2 college level classes, which comes to 102 hours, right?
That's correct.
And then in the early 2000s, the Air Force established, in order to maintain a fit force, commanders should give 1.5 hours 3 times a week, right? Which is 4.5 hours a week.
4.5. So you're going to push over 200 hours.
234 hours a year, right? That is now deferred to the individual to take out of their own time, which, you know, like that's significant. That's a significant amount of time the Air Force has now shifted. And it really comes down to, and boy, I'm getting tired of being a broken record. We could sustain squad, on duty PT in maintenance. We did it for, I think, over a year, at least a year. I mean, that's kind of a fucking blur because I was really tired. And we did it because we had enough people. The people we had were experienced. And like you said, we had parts and younger jets, which once again, the overarching message of excellence all we do and service before self is the resource has not equipped the maintenance community for excellence, and they've instilled in them the idea of service before self, which means, and which is an inverse of the idea of failure is not an option. But the reality is failure is a fucking option. When you're not resourced properly, you're going to fail. But what happens is these people are not willing to let the mission down, let their work friends down, and they have a sense of pride and duty. They're going to grind up all their personal time, throwing it into the flight line to get the fucking jets fixed. And the Air Force has now budgeted in manpower for people to do that. They have budgeted their manpower and experience to a lower level because people have been throwing themselves at the flight line with just all their heart for so long. The Air Force, for whatever fucking reason, assumes, well, that's normal. That's the output we get from this amount of people of this amount of experience. We're perfectly fine. But that's where you start seeing the PT fails come in because they don't have time anymore. And it goes back to, and the Air Force kind of just wipes their hands and goes, well, we told you that's a standard. You need to meet that standard. It's a personal failure. And here's your chances. Here's your things to get out. And there's all this shame and stigma attached to it. And never mind the fact that, and this is going to be a rabbit hole that I just can't afford to go down right now. Like, I've been diagnosed with so many things since my military retirement because I can see a real doctor who's actually interested in finding out like what's no kidding wrong with me and things like that. Whereas going to see a military doctor was just turning a candy machine full of fucking vitamin M and getting my 800 milligram pills and walking out the door. And it was almost exclusively symptom management. I'm going to get off that soapbox. That's for another time. But I lost faith that I would go see a doctor in the military and they would actually be interested in finding the source of my symptoms. Instead, they were looking at what do I need to do to mitigate it so I can get them back to work and no profile type of deal. The dynamic and the motivations just weren't there. But, so the overarching issue here is PT has to be a part of the duty day, and the Air Force should resource career fields to that level because it is fundamentally unfair to levy a 234-hour-a-year fucking burden on a career field that is, as we all know, Kevin, well, we don't know, as we all suspect, struggling with suicide, struggling with inexperience. And this isn't to say everyone in maintenance is inexperienced, but they're not given time to learn. The jets are getting older. The numbers are lower. And then you look at the coronavirus and you'd say, is PT really required then?
Because they're waiving the requirements for the tests.
We're not fucking PTing and we're flying, which tells us, what does the Air Force think is more important? Flying sorties or having a fit force? And clearly, we didn't cancel sorties to do PT and PT tests. Clearly, the answer is flying is more important. And I would berate anybody that would argue that PT is more important than flying. That's a ridiculous assumption.
Yeah, it's not even close. Right. To be honest. Right. And I think that's where the argument can be is, has PT taken over too big of a role? I think that's where the really, if you kind of rank all the things we have to do in the Air Force, it maybe did seem at times that PT took a disproportionate amount of focus. Right. I think that's really maybe where now I see that is, it wasn't that it's not, no one's really arguing is physical fitness good or bad? I think most people are going to, I think what we're coming to realize is, did PT and the PT test take on a disproportionate amount of importance compared to where it should have lied in the Air Force mission, right? Because I'm going to, like I said, for myself, I view education as more important than PT. Certainly, doing the mission is more important to PT, which for aircraft maintenance is fixing the jets and flying the jets, right? So, and I would argue that training done properly is way more important than PT, right?
Yep.
So now I've put, at best for me, I put doing the mission, which is for aircraft maintenance is flying, is 1, training is 2, education is 3. In Kevin Traw, I've put PT as number 4 most important. at best.
That's saying something for you.
Right. And yet disproportionately, what did I spend more time on, and it just was disproportionate. I think that's the only, we could talk 10 more minutes on it, but I think it was, now I've realized it was a disproportionate amount of time given its relative importance to the mission of the Air Force and the health of the force in terms of the people, because I would much rather have a trained mechanic, right? There's going to be no argument. I can argue importance of AT. If you said, hey, Kevin, would you rather have a really good trained mechanic who's signed off in his 623s properly, or someone who's really shaped? There would have been no hesitation. None. There would have been none. I've said, man, I that trained 7-level who legit can do it. It was really important to me. So again, I think that's something that, again, I think that's where now we're landing it wasn't, maybe, again, I've been retired for 7 years. My guess is it still is disproportionately talked about.
I promise.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. I'm more recently retired, but I promise. I absolutely fucking promise that PT is just as in the forefront of commanders' schedule, anxiety for people, and the amount of time allocated is just as terrible, if not worse. Here's a question. What if PT was strictly a medical realm? You
talking that the medical group owned it, or just to make people?
I mean, okay, so what was your justification for PT being important?
Oh, I think because that was the standard the Air Force has set.
But why
Right,
do you
that
think?
was-
Why do you think PT? Why do you think working out is important?
As a person,
Yeah,
I think because it leads to a healthier life. It makes you
health.
It's health.
It's health.
Yes.
Why would the medical group not be the one that is the POC focal point for PT performance?
So I think there's two reasons why it isn't. One is because it all in the military, it all rolls around to the commander's responsibility.
Mhm.
And two, I'll be honest, I like our medical folks, right? I have maybe a slight different perspective than you. They were, this is going to kill something. They're horrible at being in the military, though, right?
Okay, that's fair.
Right? They were.
Let me know after if you want to edit that out and add it to the blooper reel. I'll let you pick on that.
Okay.
Here's what I'm suggesting. PT tests still happen. I would argue that the waist should go just because it's dumb. I think
Absolutely.
I think the push-ups and sit-ups should move to 2 minutes. You reach a failure. Running, I despise running, but it fucking works, right? The only thing that sucks is for most maintainers, your knees and your back and your hips are all shot by like your 10 or 12 year mark, in which case the run becomes this fucking monumental lift. But so the run, and also you're right. The run, there's not a lot of subjectivity there. Either you start and then you finish, and there's a fucking time. That's it, right?
Right.
Unless you're finishing with a pack and the person with the watch misses the number, but that's so rare. Like whatever. What if you PT tested normally with the changes we've talked about? 2 minutes for push-ups, sit-ups, the waist. Find a way to do away with it. And if you failed, you had to go see your doctor or a medical a kinesthesiologist or somebody, and they prescribed you a workout routine based on what you failed for and evaluating you. Oh, yeah, your shoulders are rolled forward because you've been doing so many push-ups. You have an asymmetry here. You probably have an impingement here. Does it hurt? Yeah. Start doing more back exercises. You can get a symmetry back to your front and your back. Your push-ups will get easier. We'll retest you in 3 months. And there was no career impacts. There was nothing. They're just going to have somebody that's going to get you better. And then, they prescribe you. This is like a baby step. Then they prescribe you time that's duty time. Now you have to give up duty time in order to get PT to get back to where you was. I would argue that we should have PT in the duty day all the time, but this seems like a fairly good stopgap, which is akin to the commander's PT program. When you fail, you go on a PT regimen. But this case, it is for your health. You're seeing an actual doctor to determine what you think caused your failure, and you're prescribed PT and exercise, and it's not an administrative action. And you can fail and fail and fail and fail. And I kind of don't care, is what I would argue. And maybe there's an MEB 2-3 years from now. But if you're working through a medical condition or you're working through and there's not time, let them PT. That's what I would argue.
Yeah, I think that maybe doing it. I don't know if I agree with the fail, because then you're, I guess I'm going to assume if they're putting the proper effort in, right? Because if they're not putting the effort, you can get them for malingering, right? So as long as they're giving the effort, then I think that very much could work. I don't even know if I want to call it a compromise, because it is, if they are working and they're, they pass their tests, they're in shape, they're meeting that requirement, right? And certainly the Air Force can talk about, hey, it's good to maintain a healthy lifestyle because it's your body. You're going to be out eventually. You have to live with the consequences.
I agree.
That's great. And then you can have the med group again. And if the med group prescribes it, I think that interesting enough, most people are going to be more like, oh, that's just what we have to do. Right. It's like anything else. You have to go to this training or that training. It's a medical appointment. And
and I think there should be no-show letters if you don't go. Like it's a medical appointment. Fuck it.
And did I tell you one time I sent a no-show? I did.
You sent a no-show to the med group because they canceled your appointment short notice or something?
Well, they were mad at me about that, but I would do that. I would do that one again.
You could do that as a squadron commander, but not as an E4 in the Pentagon.
No, I could not, right? Because I was the one standing in line, right?
Yeah, no power. Okay, I think there's probably more to talk about. We'll probably end up revisiting. I just got to wrap up because, nobody wants to hear us talk much longer.
No, that's true.
But I guess, final thoughts as a commander that dealt with a lot of PT and the state of PT now, the emphasis. You've kind of wrapped it all up, but or do you have any final thoughts or words of advice or anything like that?
I think the most important thing, maybe we got to get PT back to either we make it during the duty day and cut back appropriately, or we go the health route that you kind of talked about. If we may not talk in the future on this topic, we can talk discipline, which is a whole different piece. But I think that that's really the route the Air Forces go, is either make it fit and cut back on the mission to make it fit and then make that priority, or push it to the medical side, which would be a much, much smaller population of people having to use that. Therefore, it's not going to have a substantial impact to the force's mission, no more than any of the other requirements would have to the mission, right? It's just one of a list of things that a unit has to balance, right? And I think that I think what we've decided, right, whether someone listens, is PT has taken on a disproportionate level of importance in the Air Force that it should not be at.
So we didn't end up disagreeing then, huh?
No, I guess we didn't. Maybe because I think I do think 15 years ago we would have disagreed.
Sure.
But maybe at the end of an hour conversation back then, we would have found we were closer to agreement than we were disagreeing. But I do think that time, and as you age, you do kind of have a time to think about this and look at it retrospectively. But yeah, no, we did not end up disagreeing. Though, interesting enough, we may have come up with some decent solutions on how the Air Force could handle the PT topic.
Which goes back to what we said at the very beginning. Share the fucking podcast so these ideas float out into that community. But other than that, Kevin, thank you very much for joining. I appreciate it. And adios.